It was a quiet evening, and Jamal and his wife, Tasha, were heading home after a long day. Tasha, who was 8 months pregnant, leaned back in the passenger seat, trying to get some rest. She had been feeling tired lately, but the excitement of the baby's arrival kept her spirits high. Jamal, a police captain, had just finished his shift and was looking forward to a peaceful night at home. As they drove through their neighborhood, everything seemed calm, until suddenly, blue lights flashed behind them. Jamal's heart sank. He immediately signaled and pulled the car over to the side of the road, trying to remain calm. Tasha, feeling the tension, glanced over at him. She could tell something wasn't right. It was late, and their neighborhood was usually peaceful. They had been pulled over many times before, but this stop felt different. The officer's car was parked too close, and the lights were flashing aggressively. Jamal's mind raced, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He knew how to handle situations like this. He was a captain in the police force, after all. The officer approached the driver's side, his hand on his gun belt. Jamal greeted him politely, trying to ease the situation. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked, rolling down the window. The officer didn't respond kindly. Instead, he barked, "Step out of the vehicle." Jamal was taken aback. "Why? What's the reason for the stop?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The officer didn't answer, just repeated his command. Jamal hesitated, unsure what was going on. As a police officer himself, he had been trained to stay calm and assertive in these situations, but this felt different. The officer's tone was harsh, and Jamal could feel the tension building. He didn't want to escalate things, but he also knew his rights. He explained calmly, "I'm a police captain. I'm just coming from my shift. Can you explain why you're stopping me?" Instead of responding to Jamal's question, the officer motioned for him to step out of the car. Jamal knew he had to comply, but he was concerned. Tasha was looking at him, her worry growing. She could tell something was off, and she placed a hand on her round belly, trying to stay calm. Jamal slowly stepped out of the car, keeping his hands visible. The second officer, who had remained silent until now, approached from the other side of the car. He was giving Jamal an intimidating stare, but Jamal refused to back down. "Tasha, stay in the car. Everything is fine," Jamal said, trying to reassure her, though his voice wasn't as steady as he would have liked. He knew that no matter what happened, his primary concern was making sure Tasha was okay. The officers didn't seem to care. They were talking to each other in hushed voices, ignoring Jamal's attempts to de-escalate the situation. Tasha could feel her heartbeat quickening, her pregnancy making the stress all the more intense. She watched from the car, feeling helpless, as the officers continued to act hostile. Suddenly, without warning, one of the officers turned to her, pointing. "Get out of the car," he snapped, as if she had done something wrong. Tasha froze, her heart racing, and she glanced at Jamal, who immediately raised his hands to signal her to stay calm. She was about to respond when the officer grabbed her by the arm. Her body tensed as the officer yanked her from the car. "Stop! What are you doing?" Jamal shouted, his voice full of anger and fear. The officer didn't answer. Tasha stumbled as she was pulled away, and she could feel the stress of the situation causing her anxiety to skyrocket. Jamal knew he had to act fast. This was getting out of hand. As the officer roughly pulled Tasha from the car, Jamal's heart raced. His worst fear was becoming a reality. His wife, who was 8 months pregnant, was being treated like a criminal, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had never imagined he would face something like this, not even in his worst nightmares. He was a police captain, after all, and he knew how to handle tense situations, but this time it was different. "Stop it. What do you think you're doing? She's pregnant," Jamal shouted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. He stepped forward, trying to get closer to Tasha. He had to protect her. She couldn't be handled like this, especially while carrying their child. The officer didn't listen to Jamal's protests. Instead, he shoved Jamal back, making him stumble slightly. "Stay back, or you'll be arrested too," the officer warned, his face hardening. Jamal couldn't believe what was happening. He had been in law enforcement for years, and never once had he seen his fellow officers act this way, especially towards someone who clearly wasn't doing anything wrong. Tasha, struggling to keep her balance, looked up at Jamal. Her face was pale, and tears were starting to well up in her eyes. She was scared, more scared than she had ever been. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life. She clutched her pregnant belly, silently pleading for the officer to let her go. "Please, I'm pregnant. Can you let me go?" she asked, her voice shaking, but the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he tightened his grip on her arm, dragging her further away from the car. Jamal could feel his blood boiling. This was his wife, and she was being mistreated. He had spent years trying to make a difference in the police force, fighting for justice, but here he was, helpless as his wife was being treated like a criminal. He knew he had to act, but he didn't want to make things worse. He looked around, hoping someone would step in and help, but the street was empty. There was no one around to witness what was happening. It felt like the whole world had turned against him. "Get your hands off her," Jamal yelled, stepping forward again, this time more forcefully. He reached for his badge, the symbol of his authority as a police officer, but the officer stopped him. "I told you to stay back." "Do not interfere," the officer barked. But Jamal wasn't listening anymore. He couldn't just stand by and watch his wife be hurt. Jamal's mind raced. He was a police captain. He was supposed to protect people. He had worked hard to earn the respect of his colleagues, but in this moment, he felt completely powerless. He knew that if he tried to fight back, it could escalate, and things could get worse. But he also knew that if he didn't act now, his wife could be in danger. Meanwhile, Tasha's anxiety continued to grow. She felt the pressure on her chest, and the stress was taking a toll on her body. The last thing she wanted was to put her baby in danger. She begged the officer to stop. "Please, stop. I'm pregnant. You're hurting me." But her pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. Jamal could feel his frustration building. The officers were supposed to be the ones keeping the peace, but instead, they were causing chaos. He had to do something. He couldn't just watch as his wife was mistreated like this. He took a deep breath and gathered every ounce of courage he had. "Listen to me," Jamal shouted. "I'm a police officer. You're making a mistake. You need to stop right now." His voice was firm, but inside, he was trembling. Jamal's heart raced as he stood his ground, his voice growing louder, more urgent. The officer, who had been rough with Tasha, paused for a moment, as if considering Jamal's words. But then, the officer's expression darkened, and his grip on Tasha tightened even more. "I told you to stay out of this," the officer growled, his voice filled with anger. Jamal's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, to stop this madness, but he knew he had to be careful. He was a police officer, just like the man in front of him. He had spent years in law enforcement, and he knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. But this wasn't just any situation. This was his wife. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. "Let her go," Jamal demanded, his voice steady despite the rising fury inside him. "You have no right to treat her like this. She's pregnant. Do you not understand that?" The officer sneered at him, clearly not caring about the consequences of his actions. "I don't care. This is none of your business. You need to leave now, before you get yourself in trouble." Jamal's mind raced. He thought of all the times he had fought for justice, all the work he had done to protect the people in his community. And now, here he was, facing an officer who clearly didn't care about the law or the safety of others. His own badge, the symbol of his authority, seemed meaningless in this moment. "Do you know who I am?" Jamal asked, his voice cutting through the tension. The officer looked at him for a moment, a hint of confusion crossing his face. Jamal pulled out his badge and held it up, the weight of his position now more important than ever. "I'm Captain Jamal Parker. You're making a huge mistake. I work for this department, and I will report this to your superiors." The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to react. But then, with a rough push, he forced Jamal back. "I don't care who you are. You're not in charge here," the officer spat, his eyes burning with anger. "Now, get out of the way." Tasha, still struggling under the officer's grip, gasped as her breath became shallow. She could feel the anxiety taking over, the stress on her body causing her to feel dizzy. She was terrified not only for herself, but also for the life growing inside her. She knew the stress was bad for her baby, but there was nothing she could do. "Please, stop," Tasha cried out, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm pregnant. You're hurting me." Her words seemed to have no effect. The officer ignored her pleas, continuing to push her further away from the car. Jamal couldn't take it anymore. He took a step forward, his body shaking with anger. This wasn't just about authority. It was about protecting the woman he loved and their child. As the officer moved closer, Jamal's voice boomed. "I swear, if you don't stop right now, I will make sure you answer for this," he shouted, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The officer stopped for a moment, glancing at Jamal. The situation had grown tense, and Jamal could see the hesitation in the officer's eyes. But it wasn't enough. The officer's grip on Tasha didn't loosen, and the tension in the air was thick. Jamal knew that time was running out. He had to act quickly, but he also had to keep his cool. He wasn't just fighting for his wife. He was fighting for what was right. Behind them, Jamal heard a car screech to a halt. He looked over his shoulder, only to see another police car arriving on the scene. This wasn't over yet, and he wasn't sure how it would end, but he knew that he couldn't let this go without a fight. The new police car skidded to a stop, its siren still blaring in the background. Jamal quickly turned his head to see two more officers stepping out of the vehicle, looking confused but ready to take charge. The officer holding Tasha took a moment to glance at the newcomers, but his grip on her didn't loosen. Jamal knew the situation could go either way. His eyes flicked to the other officers, his mind racing with possibilities. "Who's in charge here?" one of the new officers asked, looking directly at the officer who had been harassing Tasha. The officer holding Tasha looked from the newcomers to Jamal, the tension still thick in the air. Jamal saw the shift in his body language, the uncertainty creeping into the officer's stance. It was clear that something had changed. The newcomers weren't buying into the first officer's behavior. "I am," the first officer said, his voice still tense, but there was hesitation there now. "This woman is being difficult. We're just handling a situation here." But Jamal wasn't backing down. "No," he said firmly, his voice growing in strength. "This woman is not a criminal. She's a pregnant woman who is being treated like she's guilty of something. You have no reason to put your hands on her like this." The second officer who had arrived stepped forward, his face serious. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes darting between Jamal and the officer with Tasha. "We were called for backup, but it looks like we've missed something." Jamal stood tall, his chest swelling with authority. "This officer was treating my wife like a criminal. He refused to listen when she explained she's pregnant, and now she's in distress. I'm a police captain, and I'm telling you right now, this is not acceptable." The officer who had been holding Tasha seemed to falter at the mention of Jamal's rank. His eyes narrowed, but his posture softened slightly as he glanced back at his colleagues. "You should have stepped back," the second officer muttered to the first one, clearly disapproving. "This is not how we handle things, especially when there's a pregnant woman involved." The officer holding Tasha didn't argue, but instead, he released his grip on her arm. Tasha staggered a bit but quickly steadied herself, her breathing still shallow. She looked at Jamal with a mixture of relief and worry. She was safe now, but the ordeal had taken its toll. Jamal quickly moved to her side, his arms wrapping around her protectively. He could feel the tension still lingering in the air, but he wasn't about to let go of her now. His mind raced, and his heart pounded with the realization that the situation could have gone so much worse if those new officers hadn't arrived. Tasha, still in shock, whispered, "Jamal, I'm so scared. What if they hurt us?" He kissed her forehead gently, trying to reassure her. "You're safe now. I'm here. And we're getting out of here. They're not going to hurt you." The first officer, now visibly uneasy, looked to his colleagues. "I didn't mean for things to go this far," he muttered, though his tone was far from apologetic. "I was just trying to keep control." But Jamal wasn't letting him off the hook. "You can't just control people like that," he said, his voice low but firm. "You don't get to push someone around just because you think you're in charge, especially not a pregnant woman. This isn't the way we're supposed to be treating people. It's not right." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze avoiding Jamal's. The silence stretched for a long moment, and then the second officer spoke up. "You're right. We'll deal with this. Let's get this situation under control. You two can go now." Jamal didn't wait. He turned to Tasha and gently helped her into their car. He could tell she was shaken, but he wasn't going to let this moment ruin them. He knew that, no matter what, he had to protect her, especially now. As they drove off, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something big was going to happen next. This wasn't over yet. There were still questions to be answered, and he wasn't going to let this injustice slide. He would make sure it was addressed, no matter the consequences. The car ride was quiet, but not peaceful. Jamal kept glancing over at Tasha, watching her closely. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands were trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to stay calm. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Jamal could feel his own anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he didn't want to show it to Tasha. He needed to stay strong for her. He needed to make sure she knew she was safe. "We're almost home," he said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "I've got you, Tasha. You're safe now." She nodded, but didn't respond right away. Her thoughts seemed distant, her mind still processing the events that had unfolded just moments ago. Jamal couldn't blame her. How could anyone process such an experience so quickly? When they pulled into their driveway, Jamal helped her out of the car, supporting her gently as they walked inside. He knew she was still shaken, but she was trying her best to hold it together. They sat down on the couch, and Jamal made sure she was comfortable before taking the seat beside her. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "No one should ever be treated like that." Tasha sighed deeply, shaking her head. I don't understand. Why did they act like that? I told them I was pregnant. Why couldn't they just listen?" Jamal placed a hand on her shoulder, rubbing it gently. "I don't know, baby, but you didn't deserve any of that. No one does. You're a person, not someone to be pushed around." Tasha leaned into him, her head resting on his chest. "I'm just glad you were there," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't." Jamal squeezed her hand. "I'll always be here for you. No one will hurt you again, not if I can help it." But as Jamal held her, his mind was racing. The anger he had been holding back was starting to come to the surface, and he knew that something needed to be done. He couldn't just let this go. He was a police captain. He had a responsibility, not only to his wife, but to everyone in his community. This wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about a system that needed to change. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Jamal picked it up without thinking, his mind still focused on what had just happened. "Jamal," the voice on the other end said, sounding urgent. "We need you at the station. Now." It was his chief. Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach. He had no idea what this was about, but he knew it wasn't good. "I'll be right there," Jamal replied, hanging up the phone. He stood up, glancing at Tasha. "I've got to go to work, but we'll figure this out. I promise you." Tasha nodded, though she looked concerned. "Be careful, Jamal. I don't trust them anymore." Jamal gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll be okay. I'll handle this." As he left the house, Jamal's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let anyone get away with treating his wife, or anyone else, like that ever again. The fight for justice wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Jamal arrived at the police station, his mind a swirl of thoughts and emotions. He had been a police officer for years, rising through the ranks with hard work and determination. Now, as a captain, he had more responsibilities than ever before. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for seeing his wife treated with such disrespect and cruelty. The anger he had been holding back all day was now a fire inside him, and he was determined to take action. As he entered the building, he was met by his chief, a stern man named Chief Collins. Collins didn't waste any time. He looked at Jamal with a serious expression, his voice low. "Jamal, we need to talk about what happened today. I've seen the reports, but I need to hear your side of things." Jamal clenched his fists at his sides, taking a deep breath. "You know what happened, sir. I don't have to tell you. My wife was attacked by one of our own officers." Chief Collins held up a hand, his tone calming. "I know, but I need to hear it from you. The whole story. We have to handle this carefully." Jamal didn't want to hold back. He had seen enough injustice in his life, and this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. He explained what had happened, the way his wife was humiliated, how the officers had treated her with such disregard. He didn't mince words. "It was wrong," Jamal said, his voice firm. "And I won't stand by and let this kind of behavior continue. We have a responsibility to protect people, not hurt them." Chief Collins listened carefully, but his face remained neutral. He nodded slowly, taking in the information. "I understand your frustration, Jamal. But you know how things work. We can't make rash decisions." Jamal felt a wave of frustration. He knew the politics of the police force. He knew how often officers were protected, even when they were wrong. But he also knew that he couldn't let that stop him. He had a duty, not just to the force, but to the people in his community. "I'm not making rash decisions," Jamal said, his voice quieter but still filled with conviction. "But I will not let this go. Not when it's about my wife. Not when it's about what's right." There was a long silence as Chief Collins looked at Jamal. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "You're right. We need to take action. I'll start the investigation, but you have to understand, it might not be easy. There will be people who try to cover this up." Jamal stood tall. "I'm ready for whatever it takes. I'm not backing down." Chief Collins seemed to consider his words for a moment. "Good. But be careful, Jamal. This could get messy." Jamal didn't care. He knew what needed to be done. As he left the station that day, he felt a sense of determination settle in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his wife anymore. He was fighting for the integrity of the entire police force. If he couldn't trust his fellow officers to do the right thing, then it was time to make things right, even if it meant standing alone. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he wasn't afraid. His next steps were clear. He was going to take this fight as far as it needed to go. And nothing, not the force, not his rank, and certainly not the system, was going to stop him from bringing justice to his wife. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and reports. Jamal couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to Tasha and how the officers had treated her. He had promised her that he would make sure this didn't go unnoticed, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Every time he looked at her, the pain in her eyes reminded him that this wasn't just about a single officer's mistake. It was about a bigger issue that needed to be addressed. Jamal's determination grew stronger as he began to gather information about the officer who had hurt Tasha. He knew he had to be careful, but he also knew that there could be no compromise when it came to protecting the people he cared about. His mind focused on the idea that change had to start now, and if he was going to be the one to push it forward, he had to be ready for whatever came next. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in his office, going over the statements from the officers involved in the incident, He received a phone call from Chief Collins. "Jamal, I've looked into it," Collins said, his tone serious. "The investigation has begun, but there's something you should know." Jamal leaned forward in his chair, feeling the weight of his words. "What is it?" Several other officers witnessed what happened. Some have already said they were uncomfortable with how things were handled. I'm not saying they all agree with what happened, but we may have support. Jamal felt a flicker of hope. He had known that not all officers were complicit in the mistreatment of his wife. Some had to be on the side of justice, the side of what was right. "Good," Jamal replied. "It's time we made this right." As the investigation continued, Jamal met with his lawyers and the local media. He knew that things could get complicated, but he wasn't afraid to speak the truth. He shared Tasha's story, detailing everything from the moment they were stopped by the police officers to the way she was treated, all while Jamal stood beside her as her protector. The more people heard the truth, the more support Jamal received. Soon, the story spread throughout the community, and people rallied behind Jamal and Tasha. The media painted the situation as an example of the need for police reform, and the public support grew stronger by the day. People from all walks of life reached out to offer their encouragement, praising Jamal for his courage in standing up to the very system he had served for so long. But not everyone was on their side. There were still voices of opposition, including some members of the police department who wanted to keep things quiet. These people didn't want the public to know about the misconduct, but Jamal was determined not to let that happen. One day, as Jamal walked out of a meeting, he was approached by a group of officers who had supported his efforts. They expressed their concerns about the backlash they had received, but assured him they stood with him. "We believe in what you're doing," one officer said. "You're fighting for justice, and we're behind you." Jamal was moved by their words. For the first time since the incident, he felt a real sense of unity among his colleagues, those who were committed to doing things the right way. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of law enforcement and the responsibility they had to the people they served. That night, as Jamal sat at the dinner table with Tasha, he looked at her and smiled. They had come so far, but the fight wasn't over yet. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He wasn't going to let the officers who had hurt Tasha get away with it. "We're not finished," Jamal said, his voice full of conviction. "This is just the beginning. We're going to make sure that no one else has to go through what we went through." Tasha reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know you will," she said softly, "and I'll be here every step of the way." Together, they knew that their fight for justice was just beginning. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, they were ready to face them. They had each other, and that was all that mattered.